Daria couldn't see a future with her parents if they couldn't see the past.
In their various stages of recovery, I'm going to call it, I want to believe that I have room for understanding. And I think if they were able to really engage in reality and sort of just sit with what our lives were, I think I could be in contact with them. Maybe not often, but they can't go there. I think as a result of accepting that, I can kind of feel like I don't have any unfinished business.
Welcome to In This Family, presented by Nexus Family Healing. I'm Dr. Michelle K. Murray, President and CEO. When Daria Burke graduated from NYU with her MBA, her parents were not there to see it. Daria had cut off contact long ago. When Daria was growing up, her mom had a severe drug problem, which included crack cocaine. They were often without electricity and running water, and her mom was abusive and neglectful towards Daria and her sister. Daria's grandmother was a solace, providing some of the love and care the girls needed. But when that grandmother died in a car accident, her mom's drugs escalated, and so did the abuse. Her father wasn't around and had drug problems of his own. Daria found her way to college, then business school, then a high-profile career as a marketing executive with several top brands and corporations. Daria was also someone who rarely talked about her childhood. That has changed with her best-selling memoir, Of My Own Making. Daria Burke describes herself as a 45-year-old Black woman originally from Detroit, now living in Los Angeles. Now a retired and recovering chief marketing officer, she's gearing herself more toward writing and speaking about her life and the thoughtful and considered ways she's chosen to live it. Daria Burke, welcome to In This Family. So great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
I'd really like to start by asking about trauma in your life growing up. What was going on for you?
Yeah, I remember a number of years ago hearing definitions of trauma that actually put my childhood into a different context for me. I wouldn't have, even after decades of therapy, I wouldn't have necessarily used words like trauma or abuse. I think I had gotten as close to it as neglect, and I could really quickly explain that by talking about my mother's drug addiction, which was quite debilitating. My father struggled with drugs as well, but because they were separated and my sister and I, we didn't grow up with my dad in the house, there was a lot of distance from it. And we didn't have the same proximity that we had with my mom, whereas her crack addiction, I had a front row seat to it. So for me, hearing this idea, this definition that trauma is, yes, to some degree, the event, but really the outcome of the event and its lasting effects on you and the ways in which it lives in your body and in your brain and in your beliefs, the way that it can distort your self-image and sort of disconnect you from yourself. And I was like, okay, right. The very highly therapized, intellectual part of me could really get my head around that as a framework to then think about the ways in which abuse, in my case, was emotional, verbal, physical. I mean, it sort of runs the gamut of the kinds of abuse that one can experience. Having experienced those things as a child and having them been sustained over so many years, I could say out loud, okay, I experienced innumerable traumatic events over a very long period of time. And as a result, experienced a lot of trauma. And even at 45, even with all the work I've done, even with all the ways in which I've closed my understanding gaps with science, I also recognize the ways in which I'm still in touch with the parts of myself that were traumatized. And so that's how I would describe it today, and I think sort of the grief around it, and maybe we'll get more into this, but I think so much about grief and the ways in which we sort of navigate kind of those losses or those events very similarly, because we tend to think of grief as the trauma, and I actually see that as like the process. That's the healing process. That's the after effect. I think the event itself was the trauma, and sort of what we do with it and how we grieve is kind of the rest.
I love that you are talking about this. The trauma is the result of these events, and those events can be traumatizing, but it's still the trauma that's sort of the outcome of that. And yes. I think a lot of people will relate to some of the events that has, influenced you have experiencing trauma. So if you don't mind, can I just dig a little deeper into what specifically, like you first said neglect, and what are some other things that were those events? Like, was there physical abuse? Was there emotional abuse? What are some of those events that then kind of had the outcome be trauma?
Yeah, I mean, all of the above. And I want to set the context further too by anchoring it in poverty, because yes. I think that also is a deeply traumatizing experience. And so to have been raised poor, Black and female in Detroit in the 80s in significant poverty, I think both set the conditions for my mother's addiction and her inability to navigate her own issues, I think, but it also was just the very real sort of set of circumstances that we were dealing with. And I think those can't be untangled. But in terms of, my mother was a very angry addict in particular. And I try to sort of, even in my book Of My Own Making, I talk about her. There was my mom, and then there was the addict. And I think it mattered for a couple of reasons, because there were moments where I saw a softer, more tender person. They were rare, but they existed. But because her crack addiction was so extreme and debilitating, she didn't work. She collected welfare. She would get food stamps and often sell them for money to be able to buy drugs. She didn't work. I've never known her to have a job. That's not true. She had gotten a job once or twice, but maybe 2 weeks she would sort of be able to keep the job, and then she'd lose it. So she didn't work, growing up, during my growing up years. And so we were naturally, just sustenance and resources were scarce. And she was a very angry addict. And so her rage would manifest in verbal, she would call us, you name it, and any sort of affront to what she felt like she needed in that moment. If we made her too angry, if we seemed too uncomfortable, if we were fussy as kids, kids being kids, if certainly, getting out of line, I did my best to always be good. And that certainly has lasted. I'm spending my 40s trying to not be so good, but she would lash out and she would swear at us. She would call us really horrible names. She would be very quick to tell us all the ways in which we were terrible people or unwanted or burdensome or in the way of her own life and her own ability to function. And so that was just this kind of looming threat. But she would get physical with us as well. And so, she'd punch us, she'd kick us, she'd, smack us around when she was especially angry. And so I think her addiction and us being so poor and under-resourced, I think it made it easier almost for her to be angry, because then she couldn't meet her own needs. She couldn't meet our needs. And I think that also, I imagine it came with shame, but it really showed up, I think, as a lot of anger on her part. And then, the neglect was just as extreme. We went without running water at times. We would not have working electricity. At one point she was dating someone, air quoting dated. She, had a guy in her life who was an electrician, and he turned our electricity on illegally for like years. I mean, we just, it was luck, I suppose, in that regard. But, and so sometimes the only meal we'd have would be at school during lunch. And so, the neglect was far reaching as well. And it forced us to really think a lot, be resourceful as kids in ways that children just shouldn't have to figure out. How am I going to eat? How are we going to take a bath? How are we going to flush the toilet, when we go? How am I going to heat the room? And so, and growing up in Michigan, obviously winters were quite brutal. So that was tough. And we would often, if we could turn the stove on, we'd use that to try to heat the house. If we had electricity, we'd use like space heaters and things like that. But, it was, there was just a lot of trauma wrapped up in survival, and trying to navigate the day-to-day.
You mentioned resources. Can you think of some of the resources that you built out of that poverty as a child? Not so much an adult. We'll wait on the adult stuff, but do you remember how you had to problem solve as a child some of those issues?
I will say I dissociated quite young, and so I don't always know when that began, and so I don't always know if I'm accessing memories from before or after. But most extremely, I went to the grocery store on a couple of occasions and stole food. I remember I was 8 or 9, and I rode my bike to the closest grocery store we had, which was maybe 3/4 of a mile, maybe a mile away, and had a duffel bag where I was literally just taking what I could and fit it. The second time I did it, I got caught. More reasonable reactions would be like trying to go over to a friend's house after school and get snacks, or maybe, have dinner there. Sometimes a neighbor's house, but generally we were sort of cautious about anybody who knew my mom really well. And frankly, some of our neighbors, the kids in our neighborhood, their moms also had problems, and, I think were using in different ways. Most of them worked, and so I think there was some functional addiction happening in some of the households, but we got crafty. We would shovel snow in the winter to try to get money. And we were little kids who didn't know what we were doing at all and couldn't do it quite well enough to have earned anything. But I think when 2 little girls show up asking to shovel snow, people tend to they find $5, they find sort of the generosity of letting you do what you're trying to do. I think there's a respect and an appreciation for that. And then, I started working as early as I could, and I got my work permit at 15 to actually get a proper job. But we were always trying to find odd jobs and, do things like that before that to get money. And, where we were lucky, my parental grandparents would maybe for a birthday or Christmas or something, give us a little bit of cash, and I would try to either spend it right away or hide it from my mom, because she'd take it. But, we were, I think, as crafty as any kid would be, trying to figure out how to do it. And I think for me, the biggest weapon that I formed was, honestly, I think, doing well in school and making sure people liked me. Because when people like you, they will do things for you.
Yeah, sure. Can you tell me at what age, if you remember, or if you know, that your mom started to use drugs?
My earliest memory is about
Okay.
8.
And that's about the time your grandmother passed away, correct?
It is. And it's interesting, Michelle, because, and I write about this, there were signs, certainly, that my mother had problems with drugs long before my first clear memory of it. But yes, my grandmother passed away when I was 7 years old. And I think what it really signals to me, especially now knowing more about my mom's backstory and more, since the book has come out, I've learned a lot. And I think more than anything, my grandma was a buffer and a barrier to the reality that there had been problems before that. I think when she died, there was no hiding what was already there. And I think I can imagine it was exacerbated by that loss. I do think that the grief of losing my grandmother sent my mother to a place that she couldn't come back from. Whereas I wonder if she was maybe slightly more functional before my grandma died. But she was buoyed by her so much that it's really hard to say.
I want to ask about your sister. Were there any particular dynamics going on as the two of you were growing up and negotiating this world?
I think the thing that, for years, I think we just kind of felt like we were in it together. I think there was this sort of like, I don't want to say Batman and Robin, but we were just really clear that the situation was not great and that we were going to have to sort of hold each other's hands through it. My mother, though, I think she definitely inflamed the relationship early and it created fractures in it early. She would pit us against each other. She would often, my sister was, I think, always a bit more understanding or compassionate, maybe. I don't know the words that I want to use to describe her relationship to my mother, because it's not for me to say, but my observation of it was always that she had a softer spot, I think, for my mom in a way that I did not. I felt very clear that it was not okay, it would be very upsetting and frustrating. And when I would try to appeal to my mom to get better, I would write her letters and I would do things to try to sort of reach her in ways that felt acceptable. And she just wouldn't respond. And I think my sister, as a result of whatever her relationship was to everything into my mom, she would sort of like, even if she would get frustrated, get upset, she'd all sort of find her way back to her. And so my mom would kind of choose her. If there was a battle to be had, I was likely going to be the odd guy out, the odd man out. Not always, but often. But she would also just like to sort of gossip with one of us about the other and, kind of things like that. And so if one of us did something wrong, she'd naturally kind of favor the one who didn't. And so, that it takes a lot of work as siblings to have your own relationship despite that. And I think we definitely tried, but I can also see where that lived on and, how that kind of plays out in sibling dynamics. Perfect example, I'm estranged from my parents and my sister isn't.
Yeah.
That's, I would say, the straightest line from that to where we are now. I've been estranged from my parents for over 20 years, over half my life.
Do you have a moment, like a pinnacle moment, where you came to realize that you needed to cut ties with both parents? And maybe we take one parent at a time, because I'm sure the relationships are very different and the reasons are
Yeah.
different. So maybe starting with your mom, what was the pinnacle moment that you knew that you needed to cut ties?
There was a period of time, most of my college career, where she was absent. She had sort of just disappeared from our lives, and that was it was really technically our second estrangement. She had done it as well when I was in high school, where one day she sort of dropped us off at her aunt's house when I was a sophomore, and for that whole school year, we didn't know where she was and couldn't find her. So that had happened, and we had been reunited eventually in high school, and then in college, my freshman year, she sort of disappeared again. But this time it was for 2.5 years. And so right as I was graduating, I graduated in 3 years, and so right as I was graduating, she sort of resurfaced, but we weren't in contact at that point.
And this
Eventually,
this is college. I'm sorry, Daria.
College, yeah. I
Daria.
finished college at 20. Yes. And so maybe I would say like 6 months or so, maybe a year after I'd graduated from college, I don't know really what shifted for me, but I decided to sort of let her back in. And I wasn't living locally at that point after graduation, so it was mostly by phone that we would be in touch, and our conversations were, I would say, largely benign. I mean, there wasn't a lot that we would get into outside of kind of the day-to-day, what I was doing for work. I was thinking about grad school. My sister by then had 2 kids, 2 of the 4 that she has, so she had both of her daughters, and so just the musings of her parenting and things like that. My mom at that point was remarried for the 3rd time, and so just a little bit of coming together around those kinds of topics. And when I went home for Christmas that year, or maybe the following, it would have been maybe the following year, because I think I was 22 at that point, I had my sister's girls with me, and we decided to go visit my mom. I hadn't seen her at that point. It would have been probably 4 years, I think, from the last time I had seen her. So we go to visit, and not long after we're greeted, she sort of says, okay, well, I need to go take care of something. We'll be back. And so she and her husband go into the den and leave us in this other part of the house. They close the door, and they're in there for a while. And I'm like, oh my God, they're using right now. Obviously by then I knew the story. I had seen that movie a lot of times, and sat and then, would kind of go knock on the door, maybe 30 minutes in, 40 minutes in, we're coming. And she comes, and and finally we're leaving, and I yell it out, and she comes out and sort of gaslit me into like, what you're thinking is not right. That's not true. We actually just needed to talk about something, and we needed to handle something. And I'm like, I could not believe I'm standing there, kind of an agent of this undoing, in the sense that like I had taken these little girls who were, I think, 2 and 3. Oh, wow. At that point, 16 months apart. So it was like taking me and my sister into a situation that we had grown up in. And I remember I was like, and if I have my way, you'll never see them again. I'm leaving. I don't want anything to do with you. There's nothing that we have to talk about. I don't believe you. You're a liar. And if I have my way, you will never see them again. Wow. And I took them and I left, and I did not have my way. She was able to build, and maybe rightfully so, because it wasn't my call to make. But I was so angry. It was like the only threat that I could wield, because even my own estrangement wasn't a threat to her. She'd left us in the past, and so that was sort of the thing that I thought that I could say, and that was it. And so that was when I was about 22 years old. My dad came 4 years later, but he had largely not been in my life. And so we always felt estranged. There was always kind of this like acquainting ourselves with each other when I would see him. And usually when I did, it was at the house of one of his sisters. So, we would go over there and visit with our cousins or whatever. And we may or may not even see him. But if we did, it was always this sort of like bizarro, this person's your father, but you're a total stranger. So when he called me to wish me happy birthday on my 26th birthday, he didn't even know where I lived. And he's, where are you? What are you up to? I'm like, well, I'm in New York. I just moved here for grad school. I'm at NYU getting my MBA. And he says, I'm proud of you. And I just lost it. How dare you? You don't have the right. You had no hand in this. I am everything that I am despite you. I mean, just angry. Don't call me again, lose my number, kind of a thing. Like, and I was on a walk through Washington Square Park, yelling at him on the phone. Feels like such a New York thing to do in hindsight, but that was really it.
Okay, thinking about the things that you've had to overcome, what is the hardest grievance that you had to struggle through?
I think I could cry saying it now. I think everyone wants to believe that their parents love them more than they love anything else. And that love is strong enough to fight the hardest of things. Grief, addiction, their own dramas and their own trauma. You sort of want to believe that I was literally tethered to these people, to this woman, and that I'm only here because she brought me here, and that should be enough.
Yeah.
And you want to believe that force is strong enough. So I think fighting the urge to come back to that, because then it means that I'm not enough. It's not that she wasn't strong enough, or that it was, but also that I wasn't enough to help her fight it. And that's not true.
Right.
But that's a deep wound. I think that the scar tissue is there, but if you rub it hard enough, you feel it, it's tender. And I guess that's a grievance too, because it's easy to be really angry about that and to feel like, well, that's just not fair. And what else could I have done? Who else might I have been if that was intact?
In your book, Of My Own Making, you talk about post-traumatic growth. And I love that you talk about this because a lot of people are unfamiliar with this idea. Can you explain what post-traumatic growth is and what it has meant in your life?
Sure. Well, fortunately, there's a phenomenon that had been observed over years by a couple of psychologists who realized, after talking to people who had experienced traumatic events ranging from war or early loss or the death of a spouse, or traumatic events that may be things like cancer, that those people were actually reporting a higher quality of life or greater spiritual center or stronger relationships in their lives. They were actually able to say that it was vis-a-vis that traumatic event, that they could actually say that they were better for it in some way. And so post-traumatic growth describes that phenomenon, and what they found in that research is that the three sort of components that I mentioned, there are three, I won't call them stages because it's nonlinear, but three components or aspects to it that were consistently reported amongst the people where they found this to be the case, which was that they had very strong relationships, and they knew that they had somebody who was there for them. They knew those people were there for them, that they could make meaning out of what happened. And we're meaning making by nature. Unfortunately, we often will default to the negative And so we'll say, well, that happened because I'm bad. That happened because I wasn't good enough. That happened because of some other horrible thing. Rather than saying that perhaps this happened in my life to facilitate something else, or just to put it in context, even that my parents couldn't show up as parents because they couldn't get it out of their own way for whatever reason or another. And then there's the sort of benefit finding component to it, which I would argue is probably the last step if there were steps, because that can be really hard to do. And it can be, I think it's only when you've made meaning that you can then start to find the benefit.
What are some of the top 2 or 3 benefits that you have come to realize in your own life, or the ways that you have been positively influenced to be who you are because of where and what you've come from?
I mean, I think my ambition and drive for sure. And because I have it in check now, and I do prioritize alignment over ambition, but I think one of my favorite quotes is from T.S. Eliot, where it says, if you aren't in over your head, how do you know how tall you are?
I love it.
I love that quote. And I think as a result, I want the next thing that I do to be the hardest thing I've ever done. And
do you mind me asking if you know what that is yet?
Oh, I mean, I'm often surprising myself. The last one for sure was writing and publishing my book and going through that experience. I'm certainly working on my second book. I'm very early in that process.
Oh, great.
So that, but I think it might be this next chapter of sort of potentially leaving the country and moving on to just try something new and different. And I think to be uncomfortable in ways that are expansive and not for the sake of adrenaline, but that, I think there's just always more to see and to know and to understand. So I think there's that. And I definitely think my ability to put things into perspective, I'm rarely rattled about sort of the small things. And I say small knowing that that's on a scale of relativity, but for me, I'm pretty unflappable. And so I can recognize when I'm dissociating and I'm sort of creating too much space between the thing. And so that awareness is there, but it also is a benefit to my ability to sort of like let things take shape and then figure out how to reconfigure it or how to move around it or navigate it differently. And I think honestly, my willingness to talk about it all has been freeing for me. I mean, I still am always caught off guard with the response that I get from other people who say, I saw myself in your story, or you reading your book helped me understand a spouse better or a parent better or something. Maybe it wasn't their experience with addiction, but someone in their life. And I think that is an incredible benefit. I mean, that's a gift.
I am really impressed just being a woman in the work world, just impressed with how accomplished you are and where your career's taken and how quickly and just how much you have, I guess, just accomplished. Tell me how you did that as a woman out there in the work world. Then I want you brought up this alignment versus accomplishment. So I guess just talk about the secrets to your success and then how you found alignment.
The first secret was survival. And I didn't know there was another way. I really didn't. If there were two gifts that my mother gave me as a really young kid, was the emphasis on education. It was very important in my family. Very important. And so going to school and getting good grades was a non-negotiable. And she struggled with the going to school part at times because she would sort of like want us to stay back with her. And, especially if she was like coming down and sort of very sick from it. But doing well in school was always cited as the way. So I think I had that drilled into me, and I had the aptitude. And so it was really easy to see school as a safe space, and I thrived there. So some of it was just that. The other thing that she said to us, though, was that you can do anything you put your mind to. She always said that to us. I could hear it in her voice still. You can do anything you put your mind to. Now, I don't know if she believed that about her own life, and I don't know if she grew up hearing that and couldn't fully internalize it, or I don't know. I don't know where that came from for her. But she would say it to us, and clearly some part of me believed that. I went to college. I graduated in 3 years because I could. I sort of realized that I had enough credit to graduate. Even that, it wasn't deliberate. It was just sheer force. And I think I didn't really confront the pace that I had been on until I had accepted a job. I was at this point in my mid-30s, and I accepted a job as an SVP in Chicago at an agency. And I moved from New York, and they relocated me and all the things, more money than I'd ever made, sort of thing. And 4 months in, they lost a massive client, and I was new and expensive, and they let me go. Wow. And it was devastating. Yeah. So I had to confront who I was without this resume. I didn't have the title. I didn't have all the things that people were so impressed by. And that was, I think, the first time that I really interrogated how one-dimensional I had treated myself and viewed myself. And so I think, and I was still running away in a lot of ways from everything. It was like, if I just make enough money and I have enough stuff and I have enough of the title and I'm impressive enough and the resume is unimpeachable, that I'm safe. And needs aside, basic needs aside, right? Because that's true up to a point. And then you're no happier, and life doesn't just continue to bloom infinitely. But I think that was really the beginning of me sort of saying, okay, there's more to you, and you've got to figure out what that is, and you've got to get in touch with that and be okay with however your career unfolds. Of course, I got another job, and I sort of like I kind of got back on the rocket ship, so to speak, but I did it with a different clarity and a different understanding and a different perspective. And I actually think that it allowed me to not care as much about the title and the things that would come along the way. They still came, but it felt different. So, when I accepted my last corporate role as a chief marketing officer, I was 39, and it was cool, but it didn't change how I felt about myself at all.
I would just really regret not being able to talk to you just a brief minute about epigenetics.
Yes.
Can you just explain really quickly what epigenetics is and how this became a factor for you?
Sure. Well, epigenetics is simply the study of how our gene expression changes based on behavior or environment. And so the ways in which different external factors might play a role in how what's naturally in us and what we inherit may get expressed. It's also been used to describe generational inheritances like trauma in particular. And I think as a Black woman, especially when I learned about the term, it put so much into context for me and into perspective for me. I think learning about epigenetics and this idea that we inherit the sort of the ways in which one's traumatic events might impact them can be passed down. I would often tell people about my childhood and be met with this response of, well, how did this happen? How did you become this person? And I couldn't ever really fully answer the question. And so when I sort of really stumbled into the neuro social psychological explanations that helped me both render in 3D my own journey, but also explain, I think, a lot about how hard it is for other people sometimes to do the same. How do some of us thrive and get to a place where we can report post-traumatic growth, and why do some people stay stuck? That helped me a bit in framing it really beautifully, and it allowed me to, I think, have a lot more compassion, certainly for my own upbringing in Detroit, and for anyone who sort of got caught in that world, to explain how poverty plays a role, to explain how racism, sexism, all the isms that we face, how inaction, what can feel ubiquitous and pervasive, how those things really live in our bodies and our brains and our beliefs. It really just gave me so much language, but it I think more than anything, it helped me, on the one hand, sort of make sense of my mother to some degree, but also of myself, and to say, gosh, you really were kind of fighting against a lot of things, but you also found a way to put yourself in environments and around people, and to sort of show up as a version of the person that you wanted to become. It's hard for me to imagine, for example, having grandparents, in my case, grandfathers on both sides who drank, and parents who both had their own drug addictions, crack for my mother, heroin for my father, and to not have had that experience of addiction in my own life is sort of remarkable. And I spent years, I write about this, like being afraid that it was going to like show up one day and just like catch me. And it hasn't. And I think it's because I have really been so intentional, these conscious interventions, of my surroundings, my environment, my behaviors. I try to just live well, and on purpose.
And this idea of this intergenerational trauma, and that we bring those things with us, other people's experiences can manifest in our own lives. Can you just give us a little glimpse into what you have learned about your mom's journey that maybe impacted her, that made who she was, that then potentially created the environment for you that you lived in?
Yeah, I think that the sort of easy one, or the one that I can access most readily, is that her father died by suicide when she was 12.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
And it's not a story that anyone in the family has told or talked about. My mother is the only person who'd ever shared it. And I remember at one point thinking, like, is this even true? Because no one else has ever said this. But then I also was like, of course they wouldn't. I come from a family of people who would never talk about these things. And so it actually probably is true that he died by suicide. But there was another story that he had died of a brain tumor. And so that, coupled with just my greater understanding, my adulthood and maturity, but then my greater understanding, it did put into perspective how whatever that did to her, whatever she was trying to numb, was so loud. And perhaps he had similar demons that he was numbing, and drinking and all these things. You can sort of start to draw a straight line from my grandfather to my mom.
Well, it sounds like a great exploration anyhow, to keep thinking through some of that. You're clearly a very intelligent, smart, driven, accomplished person. How does somebody who has all those wonderful characteristics get from their head into their heart and soul to work through the healing and to work through that really difficult deep-seated heart work. How do you do that?
Well, I stumbled into therapy trying to troubleshoot a problem. So I'm probably not the best person to tell you. I would say this, whatever sends you to seek help, just let it. Because, and once you get there, to allow whatever comes up to come up, because I went in trying to solve for a very specific challenge of, gosh, I'm graduating from business school next year, and I was 26 years old, and my family won't be there. And so how am I going to explain this to my classmates who are going to realize that I don't have anyone here for me at graduation? I went to therapy literally to get in front of that question. And I wound up excavating everything to get to that place. And it was difficult and painful. And I think in many ways, while I'm so grateful for talk therapy in particular, I didn't fully have access to other modalities at the time. So I was still a lot in my head, and was finding that when it would get in, the way that it moved into my body was disruptive and destructive. And I felt like I couldn't function if I allowed myself to feel it. And outside of walking, which when you live in New York City is an incredible gift, but outside of walking, I didn't have a lot of somatic practices to bring into play. And so it's been a practice. Healing is a practice. It's been 20 years of coming in contact with my feelings about these things, which have of course evolved over time, and I have a different relationship to them, but nonetheless they emerge, and then I have to find a new way to be in touch with them. And I think once you can let yourself feel your feelings, which took me a very long time, if I'm honest, a decade of therapy before I really could feel my feelings, name them, and then work with them, you have to let them emerge, and you have to know that you can survive them. And then I could start to say, okay, this is a moment for meditation. This is a moment for physical activity. This is a moment for just human touch. And I'm craving the comfort of a close friend, or I need to be surrounded by people in this moment and just immersed in the laughter of loved ones, right? Then I could sort of know that's what I need right now. This is what my body is asking me for. But you also have to be able to get uncomfortable first to then know how to soothe it. And I think that's the hard. It's like when a baby cries, I think parents, I'm not a parent, but I have witnessed this enough where you go into the quick mode of, okay, do they need to be fed? Do they need to be changed? What basic needs do they need met? And they try to sort of meet them really quickly. And 9 times out of 10, they're right, because babies are new and fresh, and it's easy to sort of solve for their discomfort. When we get older, there are all these other things that might be at play, and you've got to sit with them long enough to let them tell you what it is. So that's really been it. And I think my deep desire to not live just in my head, but that my heart has a bigger role in how I'm functioning, that I can sort of meet life with love and curiosity and creative expression. And those are all heart-led energies. And so it's like, if I'm going to show up in the world and actually let it touch me and and feel it, and let my desire teach me something and follow it, then I've got to sort of have that heart-led posture. So that's honestly it, but it took a long time, but that's how I got there. And I don't know that it's ever going to look the same for another person, but I can tell you, whatever sends you to the therapist's office, or some space where you're seeking healing, just let it.
That's great. Wow, thank you. So powerful. Well, thank you again for being here on In This Family. Really appreciate you sharing yourself.
Thank you so much.
So where can people find you, Daria?
Mostly on Instagram at Daria Burke, and on my website at dariaburke.com. Between those two places, I usually can keep people abreast of what's going on and what I'm up to.
In This Family is presented by Nexus Family Healing, a national nonprofit mental health organization. You can learn more about Nexus and how to support our mission at nexusfamilyhealing.org. The show is produced by John Moe with music from Jeremy Messersmith. If you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe, rate, and write a review. I'm Dr. Michelle K. Murray. See you next time.